Exactly where we left off last time, but we said that the trick in understanding Locke is to see that he has a very broad folks, it's louder than you think, is that he has a very broad meaning to idea. Did we review that slide before? I think I did. Where, in other words, he defines idea as whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. And we said the understanding for Locke is like the inside of you. It's whatever part of you is aware of the world, your inner soul. So, whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking is an idea for Locke. In other words, it includes, as I think I said last time, it includes everything and the kitchen sink. Not everything but the kitchen sink. It includes the kitchen sink as well. So whatever we can experience or think about or perceive or feel, that for Locke gets dumped into the one category of an idea. So for ideas, you get very diverse kinds of things in Locke. They can be abstract things like 2 + 2 = 4, but they can also be sensations. Like if this were the spring, and it definitely was not the spring today, the smell of flowers or the sight of a bird or hearing a bird's song, all of those would be ideas for Locke. But they can also be inner. I still have a pain in my shoulder occasionally from when I was racing Charles Jockle down San Martin Drive and wiped out on my motorcycle. See, becoming a professor later in life doesn't mean you didn't do stupid things when you were a teenager like everybody else. And so I, occasionally still get some pain. So, something like a pain in your shoulder or your knee, that would be an idea for Locke. But also feelings of warmth and cold, or a memory image, remembering what your, grandparent looked like if they're no longer with you or whatever. So ideas for Locke are basically whatever we're aware of or can think of. And he does cite two sources, an inner source from sensation. I'm sorry, an inner source from reflection. No, these are pretty much what he lists as the operations of mind are pretty much what Descartes listed. That's another reason why Descartes was groundbreaking in that he, I want to say fleshed out, but that's, since he thought the mind was immaterial, that's not the right word to use. But he expanded on what we meant by the self or the soul, and that we have operations going on in us, doubting, believing, reasoning. Remember, Descartes was a thinking thing, and doubting was part of was an operation of the mind, part of our thinking. But we also have ideas from the senses, basically from what we observe and what we feel. So they come from these two sources. And they fit into two categories for Locke, simple and complex. And basically, a thing as we experience it is usually a complex idea. But it can be looked upon as a combination of simple ideas. And the simple ideas, like this old telephone, the simple ideas would be the qualities that it has. In other words, this telephone has a color, it has a shape, it has size, it has weight, it has sound if it rings. All of these things are properties of the telephone. Now I was saying there's going to come a time when and probably, when you could put a slide like this up and students would look at it and say, well, what's that? As everybody ditches their landline. So, to really understand, especially where Berkeley and Hume take this after Locke, if we think of a thing like a telephone as you experience it or perceive it on the desk, it's a combination of all the qualities that go together to make it up. So the complex idea I have of a telephone includes many simple ideas of the various qualities. Now again, we're really, and the British empiricists are really examining the leaves on the trees. I mean, this stuff may seem tedious and picayune. You say, well, who cares? But these little tedious picayune distinctions, though, that may seem so innocuous, really laid the foundation for a type of skepticism that, to a certain extent, philosophy still deals with, and that at least lasted, well into the 20th century. So my complex idea of the telephone then would include simple ideas having to do with its color, shape, how it feels to the touch, size, weight, sound. And these ideas relate to the qualities the telephone has. In other words, there are ideas in me of these qualities. And for Locke, now here's where we kind of depart from common sense a bit. And by the way, if anyone didn't yet sign up for a day to present their talk, might want to come up and do that at the end, or raise your and reminder that the critical reflection paper is due Monday. I checked into that, Darlita. You're correct. No class on Wednesday. I think they made that decision after I made up the syllabus at the beginning of the semester. But there is no class Wednesday the 21st. So, okay. Well, so Locke says of the ideas that we have from sensation, there are two types: ideas of primary qualities and ideas of secondary qualities. And what Locke says distinguishes them, among other things, is primary properties, he's going to tell us, are really in things. Locke is a realist. In other words, he believes that, yes, there's a real external world out there with real people in it, and it goes on existing no matter what happens to me, it's going to go on without me. And that our senses can give us some knowledge of things in the external world. But our senses, what appears to us is a little bit different from objects as they actually are in the world, because Locke is going to tell us that secondary properties are not properties of things as they are in the external world. They are subjective and in us. And secondary properties are things like the color of something, its taste. Now, I think I've talked about this before, but, you know, my dad, who was colorblind, presumably had a very different experience when he came to a traffic light than I do. Now, this actually worked against us when Dad was the sole breadwinner, because it took, well, actually, we never got a color TV. Like in the 60s and 70s, not everybody had a color TV. You know, nowadays, you know, the only way you're going to find a TV that's not color is to go to a flea market or something. But he would always just buy a black and white television set, and it was his money buying it. But anyway, things like colors, taste, smells, for Locke, those are subjective and in us. And I said, I mean, tastes are very different, right? I think I mentioned last time that I hated green peppers so much that when my mother was fixing stuffed green peppers for dinner, I couldn't even go in the house. You know, I hated even the smell of them. And yet, I mean, I had a roommate, not a roommate, but a housemate in graduate school. A bunch of us were renting a townhouse. And his idea of a snack was an English muffin, some cottage cheese, and a green pepper, raw green pepper. Now, I wouldn't have touched that green pepper with a 10-foot pole. You know, so you say, well, taste seems subjective and in us. And of course, smells, you know, now if we want to be very politically correct, you know, you don't wear cologne in quite the way people used to because you don't want to offend somebody who doesn't like or can't deal. I remember one woman I dated said that she used to wear this old perfume Charlie all the time, and she developed like an allergy to it. And we were like in a movie theater or something. She said, I think somebody a few rows away from us has Charlie. You know, she was very sensitive to it. So they affect us in different ways. And I don't know if we did this before, but basically, this is one of the arguments that Locke uses, and Berkeley repeats it, to try to convince us that qualities like heat and cold are not really properties of things, but they're subjective and in us. I think I might have mentioned as we had this sink growing up, and I inherited the house, and unfortunately I still have the sink. But it had the kitchen sink had two separate faucets, hot and cold, and sometimes if I came in, the cold was closest to me, and I just washed my hands with, you know, soap and water under the cold water. Well, I can remember sometimes my brother and I would go sledding. There was a hill out in front of the house, and you know, our hands would be very cold and wet from sledding and little gloves that weren't very good. And I'd put my hand in the cold water and it would feel warm because my hands were so cold. Well, this is the kind of thing Locke is trying to say. Suppose this is hot, this is cold, and this is room temperature. If you put one hand in the hot and one hand in the cold, and you leave them there to get accustomed to it, and then you take them out, the one that was in the hot, you put in the room temperature water, and what happens? The room temperature water is going to feel what? going to feel cold, right? Or you take the hand, let's say we even had some ice cubes in here, that was in the cold water, you put it in the room temperature water, and this feels warm, even hot. So, so what is Locke's point here? Well, he says, wait a second, the same water can't have two opposite properties. The same water can't be both hot and cold at the same time. So how do we get away from that apparent contradiction? Well, he says the way you get away from it is you say that heat and cold are not really properties of the water, but they're in us as subjective properties. Now, again, does that vie with your common sense? I mean, a lot of us think that heat and cold are properties of the water, but people would think that back then. They would say, well, these are just the uneducated, the uneducated man and woman on the street, think that colors are properties of things and heat and cold, but that just shows that they're uneducated.
Would you think that temperature was subjective? Like, you say something's 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Is that subjective or is that a property?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because we do think that we have an objective measure, that's not going to change from perceiver to perceiver. Now, they do know. See, what he would argue is a constant is the motion of the molecules in the water. See, they knew about, the increased motion of the molecules if you heat something up. But basically, he still tries to say heat and cold are not properties of the water. Now Berkeley, this wasn't Locke, but it was Berkeley. Berkeley tried to say that even a property like size or length, actually the argument was number is subjective. And Berkeley's example was, now number was supposed to be a primary property for Locke. In other words, there's really one cell phone on your desk in the real world. It's not a function of how you and I perceive it. There really, the number of phones on the desk is one, and that's subjective. But then Berkeley says, well, consider a yardstick. I remember, this is the British system. They do have inches and yards. He says, well, what's the number associated with a yardstick? He says, is it 1 for 1 yard? Is it 3 for 3 feet? Or is it 36 for 36 inches? He says, well, that's relative to the perceiver. Yeah, now, I'm not saying that's a good argument. I'm saying that's one of the arguments. So even though we have what seems to be an ironclad standard of measurement, he says even that can be subjective. So, I mean, Berkeley wanted us to conclude from that number is a subjective property. Now, we think of some of these people as old fuddy-duddies, right? But Berkeley, when he wrote some of his best stuff, was like 21, or 20, So, at any rate, Berkeley has an argument similar to this. Suppose we have like a fireplace here and the fire going, right? And Berkeley says, I mean, let's say we come in on a cold day like today, right? And you want to warm yourself by the fire. And you and I know that if we had a nice fire going, it would be a pleasant sensation to stand distance from it, and so Berkeley says, you know what, a low degree of heat is a pleasant sensation. It's pleasantness. But you and I know if we got too close, if we got a little too close to the fire, we could actually burn ourselves. Maybe you burn your hand, you're trying to get too close. Well, Berkeley says, well, a higher intense degree of heat is a pain. But then he goes on to say, well, you wouldn't want to say that pleasure and pain are in the fire as properties of the fire. So why would you want to say that heat and cold are in the fire or that heat is in the fire as a property of the fire? Now there are, Thomas Reed tried to unpack this and say there's a little confusion going on here in Berkeley, but that was one of his arguments to try to support Locke's claim that heat and cold are subjective and in us. So Locke and later Berkeley used arguments like this to try to support the claim that these secondary properties are subjective. And so here I just describe, if you place them, one hand feels cold, the other warm. We must either conclude that the same water is both hot and cold at the same time. This is an argumentative technique called reductio ad absurdum, or literally reducing to absurdity an opponent's position or presenting an argument that makes absurd the opposite of what you want to prove. In other words, you assume something. Here, in this case, you assume that heat and cold are properties of the water. And then you say, well, if we assume they're properties of the water, then the middle bucket ends us up in a contradiction because the water is both hot and cold. So in order to get out of the contradiction, we then assume, conclude the opposite of what we originally assumed. We originally assumed hot and cold are properties of the water. That led us into contradiction. So they're not properties of the water, they're subjective and in us. Again, I'm not even saying this is my view. I'm just saying that, this seemed, in other words, they were very fond of thinking, well, the uneducated vulgar out there, meaning ordinary people on the street, they go on believing this way, but educated people know that colors and sensations like heat and cold are not real properties of things. But now, Locke, as I said, is a realist. In other words, he thinks there's an external, real, material world. And so while the secondary properties are subjective and in us for him, the primary properties are really properties of things as they exist, as they are in the real world. And they're things like size, shape, molecular texture, motion in space, location in space. In other words, the tops of these tables are more or less, if we forget the rounded edges, they're more or less rectangular, right? But they also are gray, kind of grayish, speckle gray with with black trim. Well, what Locke is saying here is that the gray color is subjective and in us. It's not a property of the table as the table exists in the real world. However, primary properties, like the size of the table really has the size for Locke that my senses tell me it has. Its top really is rectangular in the real world. In other words, the shape of it really is rectangular. And it's located where I think it is in space. So, in other words, Locke says our senses do give us correct, reliable information about the primary properties of things in the world. And Locke says our ideas of these things do genuinely resemble them, so they accurately convey knowledge of them. Now, let me pause this for just 1 second. Remember I said that the British empiricists are where Descartes put them, in the egocentric predicament. Now, I've never seen the president in person, okay? I've never met him. And yet, I believe I know what he looks like. And how is that? Well, because I, like you, have seen pictures of him in newspapers and what have you, or magazines, and video on television. In other words, we've seen representative pictures. For Locke, the sort of seat of our soul, our inside, and this is why he calls his book an essay concerning human understanding. For Locke, the understanding is like the part of us that's aware of the world and what goes on. And so you could say, well, what are our minds immediately acquainted with? And I think I said last time, and this is sometimes called the theory of ideas. Basically, for Locke, ideas are the immediate objects. Of perception. In other words, we're first acquainted with our inner ideas, an inner picture. And for Locke, those inner ideas all relate to an object out there. I mean, to get an example, I don't have take this roll of towels, right? And this is one way that Locke's theory and the people who followed him differ from what might be your ordinary common sense view. Most of us think if we're looking at the roll of towels, we see directly a roll of paper towels or whatever, let's call it paper towels, for lack of a better word, right? But Locke's theory is that we are never directly acquainted with anything in the external world. But we know, and we have information about things in the external world. We know things in the external world by means of internal representative images, like pictures. So for Locke, now notice, we have one roll of paper towels, but your experience, Benjamin, is slightly different from mine when you look at it. And similarly, yours, Ahmed, and Joshua's and Carolyn's back in the back of the room is different yet. It looks smaller. Well, what's the answer to the fact that we have slightly different subjective experiences of the role of paper towels? Or for Locke, he says what's happening is, let's do about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we have 11 of us in here. For Locke, what's going on, and the reason we're having slightly different experiences of the role of towels is we each have, our minds are immediately acquainted with an inner picture of the towels, an inner image. And it's going to differ, varying on your angle and distance from the towels. But in other words, what's going on here is, if there are 11 of us in here, we're having 11 private mental images or pictures of the towel, the roll of towels, but for Locke, they all relate to one and the same object in the external world. This is called an indirect theory of perception. In other words, we're never directly acquainted with things in the world, but only with representative images of them. However, for Locke, while some of the qualities we experience in a thing are subjective, he says my inner ideas that represent things like the rectangular shape of this table really correspond to an idea in me. But for us, going back to primary and secondary qualities, what we experience as a material object is, as we experience it, a material object is a combination of its primary and secondary properties, some of which are not really in the telephone, like its red color. Basically, Locke's story is that the primary properties, like the motion of the molecules of the telephone, produce in us ideas of its secondary property, like its red color. But things like the size and shape of the telephone are really out there in the telephone as it exists in the real world. So things for Locke are different as we perceive them than the way they are in the real world. We perceive them having primary and secondary properties, but in the real world they don't. But this is called indirect realism. In other words, Locke thinks that there is an external material world that's real, but we never know it directly. We know the external world only by means of inner representative images. So how do I know what Barack Obama looks like? I've seen pictures of him, representative images. But for Locke, all the mind is directly acquainted with is its ideas, and they might come together to form the image of a roll of paper towels. But so the way we perceive things in the external world is by means of images that resemble them in their primary properties. Now, So indirect realism then is the doctrine that we cannot know the real world directly, but we have to infer things about the real world from representative images. But the problem is, this sets up and has formed the basis of what later philosophers called veil of ideas skepticism. Because it sets up a veil of ideas as immediately perceived images between us and the world. Now, this relates back a long time. In the early 90s, I was looking to replace my VCR. And then, even then, my brother and I liked hi-fi stereo VCRs. It's much better sound. And they had a local stereo and appliance store that was very much like Best Buy or H.H. Gray. I forget what it was called. Now, big TVs back then were not what they are now. They weren't flat screens, but they were projection TVs. That's the only way you got a big set back then. I can remember playing backgammon at various bars in the 1970s, and they'd all have these projection TVs to show sports on. And the technology was so bad that they were never adjusted right. The colors were always way off, And I imagine they knew that because they're trying to obviously sell these big projection TVs. And so they wanted to show you that the colors are good and reliable. And how did they do it? Well, now back then, a home video camera was, you put a VHS tape in it, and it was as big as the professional ones you see now. It was a huge sucker. Well, they had one of these things set up to demonstrate the camera as well, and it was aimed at a doll on a chair. The reason I go into this is it really illustrates the pickle Locke is in, I think, very well, in a sort of down-to-earth way. And the point is, what they did was they set a doll up on a little doll chair, and they had this camera pointed at it, and they fed the image into a number of big screen projection TVs. Now, how could you tell, and I'm not looking for anything deep and dark and metaphysical, but in an ordinary common sense way, how would you tell if the picture on the TVs was good and representative of the colors, in real life of the doll? What would you do? I mean, it's probably so obvious that in other words, if you were going to say, well, okay, is that an accurate picture? Well, if you see the doll, right? So you look at the doll and you look at the picture on the TV and you compare them, right? And you can say, well, the color and the image either is or is not a good image and a good representation of what the doll actually is. But here's the problem. The mind for Locke is immediately acquainted with its internal images of things. But unlike us in the stereo store, as Richard Rorty says, we'd have to get out of our own skin to get behind the image. In other words, the only thing we ever know or are acquainted with on a view like Locke's is the internal image. But we can never get beyond that to compare our subjective internal image of something like the book bag or that with things as they really are in the world, like we compare, like we compare the image on one of those TVs with the doll. In other words, in principle, we can never get beyond what's immediately perceived, our internal image of something, to compare it with things as they actually are in the world, to confirm what Locke firmly believed, that, that our senses give us reliable information about things that are really existing in the world. And so we're making a logical leap between the world as I perceive it and the world as it really is. And Berkeley, after Locke, and Hume basically point out that this logical leap is unjustified, even though Locke thinks we can make it. So it leads to skepticism because we never can get beyond our internal ideas to compare them with the real world and confirm that they accurately represent it. Locke, this is called a representative theory of perception. The mind is acquainted first with its own inner life, its own ideas and sensations, but they represent things for Locke in the real external world. But the trick is to justify the claim that they accurately represent things. Now, it's a good way to transition to Berkeley. I don't know, you might look also at Locke on politics. I uploaded I want to make one more point about Locke's theory of perception here, but I don't want to forget to remind you. I uploaded a PowerPoint that has to deal some with Locke's politics and also his defense of capitalist economics. Very prominent historical defense, even though it has its problems. Now, there's also some of Adam Smith on there. Don't worry about that. We're not going to go into Adam Smith. I mean, you can look at those slides if you like. But we may look a little bit at Locke's politics. Locke's view leads to skepticism about whether our internal representative images accurately represent the world as it is. But now, one time I went into the store, and as before, there were images of the doll on the screens, but I saw, as I walked a little further, that the camera was off, and I don't even think the doll was sitting on the chair. They must have been playing the tape. And this part in my little illustration confirms another thing about Locke's theory that's problematic. If all we're ever acquainted with is our inner experience of things, not only can we not justify the claim that our inner experience accurately represents things as they are in the external world, but the doll wasn't even there on the chair. We can't even defend the claim that they represent anything beyond themselves. And of course, this is fine for Berkeley, because for him, all we need is the ideas. And we'll go there next. So in other words, Locke's view is very hard to defend. Once you set up a veil of ideas between us and the external world, and say what the mind is first acquainted with is not something in the external world but its own internal perceptions, then you start getting into real problems. Now I think there are ways around it, but these pose real problems for the British empiricists. So we'll look a little bit at Berkeley next. And again, to understand how somebody in his right mind, because Berkeley was not insane, can seriously tell you that there is no such thing as material substance. There is no material world as philosophers talk about it. Everything is ultimately mental and consists either of minds or the experiences of minds, the ideas and sensations in minds. In order to understand how he comes to that, again, remember that for Locke, an object in what Locke would call the material world is nothing more than a combination of its primary and secondary qualities. One strategy Berkeley had is he used similar arguments to Locke's to agree that the secondary qualities are subjective and in us. But then Berkeley goes on to use other ideas that are other arguments, that are very similar, to try to convince us that the primary qualities as well are subjective and in us. Well, if a telephone sitting on the desk is nothing more than a combination of its primary and secondary qualities, and now both are subjective and in us, then the entire telephone is mental and consists of nothing but a conglomeration of sensations in us. And so this is where Berkeley goes. This is how he gets to the claim that everything's ultimately mental. And what Berkeley wants to do, now Locke wrote at least one book on Christianity and fits somewhere in the Christian tradition. I've never been able to quite make him out there. But Berkeley was very devout. Later he became a bishop in the Church of Ireland. One of the things that Berkeley wants to do in defending what's called immaterialism or idealism, the view that everything is ultimately only mental, is he wants to cut a leg out from under the atheists and skeptics, and he thinks that a lot of them use the belief in an external material world to lead to views that reject, for him, Christianity and Christian belief, because he thinks not everyone's a dualist like Locke and like Descartes and believes that there's both material and immaterial substance. A lot of people once you tell them there's an external material world, they go to materialism, the view that the only thing that exists is matter. And of course, if the only thing that exists is the material world, and God supposedly, there's a biblical verse that said God is a spirit and we have to worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, so much for our having an immaterial spirit or soul, so much for the existence of God as a spirit, if only matter in the material world exists. So Berkeley wants to kind of, he's got another agenda cooking. He wants to defend Orthodox Christianity against atheists and skeptics by undermining the belief in a material world that's so amenable to them and that supports their atheism and skepticism. So we'll look at that next time. Again, the critical reflection paper due Monday, and no class on the 21st. So take care. Have a great
Do you want
day.
to set up on here, or?
Yeah, if anyone still has to sign up for a day for their talk, come up in time. This is from my other class, but well, obviously this week is pretty much gone, and there's no class on Wednesday. Nobody wanted to. You can either sign up for Monday. Well, see, there's no class on Friday either, because the Thanksgiving break is from the 22nd all the way through to that Sunday. So most people have been signing up after the class, and there aren't that many people that we can't go over. So there's Monday the 26th, or the 28th, or the 30th, and whatever seems agreeable to.
When's your last test?
Fine. The last class session is going to be on I think the 7th, and then final exam week is following that. I think I put the date of your final exam on the syllabus.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the exact